the West was on the brink of political crisis in the 2010s, then that spark would be lit with three events nearly back-to-back. On June 16th, 2015, real estate magnate, media figure, and the guy from The Apprentice, Donald Trump would descend from the golden escalator in New York's Trump Tower. On June 23rd, 2016, the United Kingdom would vote in a referendum to leave the European Union. And on November 8th, 2016, the American presidential election would be decided, with Donald Trump winning the presidency. The sheer amount of changes that happened in those few short years is staggering. Political dissatisfaction in the United Kingdom had been increasing rapidly. Beginning in 2010, the Conservatives had returned to power in Parliament, albeit with a coalition government at first. And in 2015, Conservatives would win an outright majority, crushing the Lib Dems into irrelevance. Yet the British people were unhappy. They had developed an enormous distrust of their government, and they could feel that their economic circumstances were worsening. There had for a long time now been a sizable fraction who wanted to leave the European Union. Led significantly in part by Nigel Farage and the UKIP party, the British people would get their chance at referendum. The liberal internationalist upper classes of Westminster and Whitehall, as well as the media of Britain, didn't believe that the British people were going to vote in favor of leaving the European Union. To their mind, the end goal of liberalism was globalism, and as the common people of Britain and the ruling classes became increasingly isolated from each other, many of these classes didn't ever hear dissatisfaction with the European Union. They had never heard sovereigntist arguments, and they couldn't imagine that people would be dissatisfied with the economy, not while they were surrounded by such wealth. Increasingly, people had come to believe that the British right of self-determination had been lost, and that decisions for the country were increasingly being made in Brussels. This would heavily apply to economic regulations. Yet more than that, the thing that really drove the Brexit vote was immigration. Going back decades now, ever since Germany had introduced their guest worker program, immigration had begun to rise sharply. Germany would become overloaded, unable to handle the amount of immigration, and would begin asking other European countries to take some of them, which the other countries would. Yet for decades, this was at a relatively small scale. By the time of the 2010s, the sheer scale of immigration in the United Kingdom was enormous, far beyond what the 20th century had seen. Ever since facing the economic crisis and realizing the problem of their age demographics, with a serious imbalance between old and young, while maintaining a large welfare state and a very demanding pension system, some in the British state and in corporate Britain had come to believe that the solution was in bringing in foreigners. This was not simply to get more workers, but to create a false picture of GDP. Believing that the guilt was in a precarious situation, it was believed that in a high-tax system, if money could be moved to a large immigrant population, then this in turn would circulate through the economy, creating a picture of a more vibrant economy than really existed, improving the position of the gilt in international markets, thereby allowing the government to continue its borrowing, and borrowing an enormous amount of money. There were other interests wrapped up in this as well. A belief had emerged that not only could the labor market be filled, and cheaper labor made more available, all while making the numbers of the British economy look better, but also that if Britain were made so multicultural as to functionally eliminate English culture, then this would create a cosmopolitan society in which the sovereigntist arguments against globalist labor would be rendered obsolete. Tony Blair's speechwriter, Andrew Neither, who is frequently involved in Downing Street, states that an additional objective was to rub the right's nose in diversity and render their arguments out of date. This served both a practical political purpose in the acquisition and maintenance of power, all while eliminating any threat posed by the population, who, in a nation of constant ethnic divide and limited cohesion, would be much less able to move in a unified way against the ruling class, but in many cases was often genuine and ideological. The liberal belief of tabula rasa and the international community had led many of the ruling classes to believe that ethnic and cultural diversity was a good end goal in and of itself. They genuinely could not imagine why much of the British population would be opposed to this immigration, much illegal, though mostly legal. The lower and middle classes felt that their communities were being destroyed, like their cohesive communities, built up over centuries, had now had a mass influx of people with no interest in being a part of it, nor any shared heritage or beliefs. They were alien peoples with a different way of life. Crime would increase, and people would feel increasingly unsafe in the towns that they had known for centuries. Everything they valued about their homes was gone. It was alien and unrecognizable, all while their economic circumstances worsened. Many found it harder to get jobs, and home ownership plummeted. Even when they could get jobs, this cooked labor market had led to a sizable decrease in real wages. They felt as though they had lost their homes, that they no longer had a community, that the legacy of their people was forever gone, and that the world of their ancestors was alien and unsafe. This would dramatically escalate, as it would be revealed that there were a vast number of violent sexual attacks which had been kept quiet by the government. Yet to the ruling classes, this was incomprehensible. They couldn't conceive of someone feeling as though their home was gone, someone feeling unsafe in their neighborhood, or lamenting that their daughter could no longer walk to school. They couldn't comprehend the economic destruction that had happened across Britain. Because of the ideological sphere that the ruling class existed in, they could only comprehend of one objection to the immigration policy, that the lower classes must simply be bigots who hate others for no reason. And thus, in 2016, it would come as an enormous shock when, greatly motivated by hoping to leave EU immigration terms, Great Britain would vote leave. If Brexit was a shock, what would happen on November 8th would mortify them. The 2016 election cycle began with a wide-open Republican field. At its peak, the Republican primaries had 15 candidates, while the Democrats only 5. Despite the enormous field, to the establishment Republicans, they had a belief that Jeb Bush was destined to be a nominee, and perhaps more than that Jeb would then lose to Hillary Clinton. Everyone knew that Hillary was supposed to win. Bernie Sanders had begun to gain momentum, largely coming off of anti-establishment movements like Occupy, the mounting distrust of the political and economic system. Yet they largely distrusted that the Democrat Party would ever give them a real chance to win. This would be borne out, as by June 7th of 2016, Hillary Clinton would secure the necessary delegates that she needed to be nominee. This included superdelegates. This raised great ire, particularly amongst the Sanders supporters, who felt robbed of their vote, that they had voted in the primaries, yet the elite of the Democrat Party had been given special vote, overriding their ability to choose in the primary. And many felt that even if Hillary would have won anyway, the methods employed were simply too corrupt. While the Democrat primaries functioned more as a mere formality to coronate Clinton, the Republicans was anything but. Donald Trump would show a wild, blunt, and entertaining style. This created an odd bifurcation. Normal people saw this and thought, wow, this is refreshing. I've never seen a politician talk like a human, while the ruling political class saw this and thought, well, clearly he can't win. He has no polish. This isn't how a politician talks. Out of the question. He spoke of the hollowing out of America's economy, the untrustworthiness of the American government and politicians, and in a bold move, described the wars in the Middle East as needless deaths that the American people had been tricked into. To many of the political class, they believed that this would hurt him with veterans and their families. That in telling those who had been hurt by the wars that they had been tricked into needless conflict, that he would be telling them that their suffering was all in vain. Yet this was another example of just how disconnected the ruling class and the lower classes had become, for this was exactly what the lower classes were thinking, and they just wanted to hear someone in power acknowledge it. He spoke about mass illegal migration and the economic threat posed by China. These all went directly to the concerns of the lower and middle class, and after securing the nomination, the comparison between him and Hillary Clinton was stark. Perhaps the most emblematic moment was Hillary Clinton's description of a great deal of Donald Trump's voter base as deplorables. This went exactly to the main reason why the lower and middle classes had come to hate the elite class. They were happy to see others wealthier than them. They didn't resent success, but what they resented was the coastal elite classes denigrating their cultures, their way of life, and talking down to them. Terms like bitter clingers and now deplorables. There was no question in the minds of the lower class that the ruling class of DC hated them, And because of this reason, another interesting phenomenon would emerge that utterly baffled the upper class. Many supporters of Bernie Sanders during the primaries would end up voting for Donald Trump in the general. They spoke to many of the same things, the same concerns. They both acknowledged that the system wasn't working and that politics had become corrupt. But perhaps more than anything, they spoke to normal working class people as if they were people whose lives mattered, whose way of life should be protected, and who society should look out for. Upon seeing that there could be success outside of the establishment, and with social media growing so large, there was a massive burst of energy for new ideas. On the right, many lower-class populists were right-aligned, as generally rural populations are more conservative. Different types of traditionalists began to emerge as well, particularly civic traditionalists, who were still heavily rooted in liberalism and took most of their ideas from traditional American civics. There was also a revitalization of Christian traditionalists, who believed that it was Christian values that would be necessary in order to revitalize and save the country. Across many different ideological spheres, sovereigntists became one of the most dominant forces. They wanted the American economy to work for the United States and not for a globalized project. There was a new burst similar to what the paleocons had been, showing many Burkean and Kirkian beliefs. Strains of post-liberal thought began to emerge, although this was still in the early days of that process. Increasingly more libertarians were becoming aligned with the right, with many becoming dissatisfied with what groups like the Libertarian Party had become. There were also different forms of nationalists which began to emerge. The two main camps showing up around this time were civic nationalists and ethnic nationalists. Civic nationalists, placing the nation and civics of the United States first and foremost, while ethno-nationalists would place ancestry and ethnicity primary. From the left, that odd nexus of critical theory, queer theory, gender theory, new forms of feminism, and academic social justice rapidly increased their forcefulness, attempting to exert more cultural and political power, and to get the corporate and political institutions of the United States to go along with them. They would garner enormous steam in these years. There would also be populist dissident socialists, many of whom who rallied around Bernie Sanders. They were more traditionalist socialists in many regards, a spot somewhere between Fabian Marxism and American progressivism. They primarily focused their attention on economic entities and especially the influence of political lobbyists. There would be a sharp increase in establishment socialists as well, the types often derided as champagne socialists. They were largely a new and rebranded form of Fabian progressivists, who wished to increase the power of the state. Yet, unlike the dissidents and populists, wanted it to be done via the existing institutions and establishment. There would also be similarly idealed, but more dissident progressivists, like the types embodied by the Justice Democrats. They were quite hard progressivists, but believed that the system was corrupt. They instead focused on trying to get new people into government. Traditional communists would also proliferate on the internet. There would also be a very interesting phenomenon that mirrored something that had happened in the 60s and 70s, where some ethno-nationalist groups would become allied with the more Marxist left, particularly Islamists, Arab ethno-nationalists, and black ethno-nationalists. It would still be very early on in the process, but we would also begin to see the dissident liberals begin to emerge as a notable group. In 2016, Donald Trump would win supported by a very unusual coalition, yet one that makes perfect sense. He would gain support from the rural poor, who felt, and had been, abandoned by the ruling class. He garnered support from lower and middle-class populists, middle-class mothers, who felt that Hillary Clinton may make the world more unsafe, and may be more likely to send their children to war. Some libertarians, and there is quite a divide emerging amongst libertarians at this point. The energy sector, who had felt under attack by Obama for the past several years. The working and labor classes, sovereigntists across different beliefs, veterans who felt hurt and abandoned by the state, a coalition of those who were generally opposed to the left, those who were distrustful of Hillary Clinton, gun owners, many Obama voters who believed in his optimistic message only to become disillusioned when finding him more similar to Bush than they'd expected, and much of people who had constituted the Tea Party movement. Though originally treating him as entertainment, much of the establishment came to view him as a threat, and the embodiment of this popular surge that was moving against them. That if this popular momentum could make its way to the White House, then perhaps it could topple the ruling class. They feared that much of the trade and economic structure that had been built up may be unwound, that the influence of the administrative state diminished. The media in particular was fearful that his message of media dishonesty was resonating so strong, and feared the loss of influence and relevance. There was also a fear amongst the more ideological that the greater liberal project may be coming to an end. He began to be attacked, particularly in regards to his strong move against immigration. It was an attack on the project of globalization, the liberal belief in an international brotherhood of man, where borders mean less and less. It's much more easy to accept that your detractors are simply mindless and hateful than that the project that gives you the right to be in the ruling class that you are may be untrue. But more than just being an attack against the system in a policy manner, it was seen as an aesthetic insult. This had been a factor of Donald Trump's life for decades. In New York, he was always seen as lower class and not truly of the upper class. People with much less wealth than him would be higher class than he was. And this is owing to his family and the nature of how they made their wealth being viewed as slumlords. He would take his father's enterprise and instead of working on lower class developments, begin working on resorts and casinos, which are seen as higher class. Also, he was from Queens, and this was seen as much lower than being a Manhattan developer. He worked closely with unions and the working class, and this developed a style of speech that was seen as uncouth. And now having a Queens slumlord property developer who spoke poor and was ostentatious in a way of what a poor person's imagination of wealth must be, end up in the White House, was a direct attack on the upper class itself, not only in policy, but in class. For the ruling establishment, this had to be stopped, and stopped by any means necessary. With the election secured, the new president had to set out to build a cabinet. The only problem is that he had no experience in Washington, D.C. He came to rely on people who had been deeply embedded in government for quite some time, a decision which he would later regret. Prior to winning the election, he had chosen Mike Pence as his vice president. The Indiana governor was chosen for a couple reasons. One, his bland establishment nature, which he believed might put the establishment more at ease. He also wanted to increase his favorability amongst evangelicals, many of whom objected to his more wild New York 1980s guy lifestyle. He would choose Rex Tillerson, a former ExxonMobil chairman and CEO, as Secretary of State. The energy sector was an important constituent that he needed to keep on his side. He would choose Steve Mnuchin, who had been a Goldman Sachs banker, a hedge fund manager, and a film producer, as his Secretary of the Treasury. Marine Corps General Jim Mattis, who had held many commands during the global war on terror and was commander of CENTCOM, would become his Secretary of Defense, and former Alabama Attorney General and Senator Jeff Sessions would be chosen for Attorney General. This cabinet was filled with many establishment figures. He would describe them as actively working against his populist agenda, attempting to steer the administration back toward the status quo. The early years of the administration would begin with a fair degree of new policies and legislation. During the first year, he would begin implementing a series of deregulation efforts, including Executive Order 13781, promoting energy independence and economic growth. This time would also see increased immigration enforcement, which had been a key element of the campaign's platform. The following year, he would sign some major legislation, such as the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, a bill which rolled back some of the provisions of Dodd-Frank aimed at small and regional banks. He would sign the Agricultural Improvement Act, legalizing industrial hemp, continuing agricultural subsidies, and food assistance. He would also sign the First Step Act, a major overhaul of sentencing laws designed to decrease both incarceration and recidivism. He would issue Executive Order 13841, ending the policy of separating families at the Mexican border, and Executive Order 13853, creating new sanctions targeting those who were deemed to be involved in human rights abuses. This year would also see the beginning of major tariff implementations, including tariffs on aluminum and goods from China. During the same year, the United States would also be withdrawn from the JCPOA, with new sanctions applied to the Iranians. All the while, his internal conflicts were growing. During the election, the Hillary Clinton campaign had sought out the aid of political research organization Fusion GPS, looking for information about her opponents. Fusion GPS would seek out Christopher Steele. He would create a report documenting the Trump campaign working with Russian agents in order to rig the election. It would be said that groups involved in hacking and in social media campaigns appearing to originate from Russia were associated with the Russian state and were working for the Trump campaign at his behest. Christopher Steele is a very curious figure. After graduating Cambridge, he would be recruited by MI6, going to work in the embassy in Moscow. This was right at the era where the Soviet Union had fallen, yet Britain wanted to exert influence in the country. He would later work in Bangkok and in Paris, before returning to Britain to work at the Russian desk in MI6. These years would overlap with many British endeavors to influence the new post-Soviet Russia, and while precisely what he did is a mystery, he was certainly right in the heart of a very pivotal place at a pivotal time. After 2009, he would go to form Orbis Business Intelligence, a private intelligence firm, creating intel reports for clients. Much of his work would make claims that Russia was intervening in foreign countries. In fact, a great deal of it was just, the Russians are interfering in blank country. That seemed to be his main thing. What would be kicked off with this report, and would be exacerbated by elements of the American government and media who wanted to stymie the Trump administration, would lead to a 3-year-long investigation into the claim that Donald Trump was a secret Russian agent, or perhaps he was working with them and paying them, or perhaps they were blackmailing him. It was never really nailed down. This became the largest media story for years, and produced an enormous frenzy, only to be quietly retired when nothing came of it. National tensions were increasing rapidly, partially fueled by the media environment, both the television and print media, but the nature of social media as well. Algorithms had come to find that user engagement was maximized when people were upset, and thus, as the algorithms were designed to maximize user engagement, they in turn maximized people being upset. During those years, it seemed that every day was a new story designed to whip people into an absolute panic. Television and print media were beginning to decline, yet in these years, they still had a quite sizable presence. One could turn on Fox News and be absolutely assured that Obama was a communist, and if the Democrats ever won, then the gulags would be rolled out, but first everyone would be castrated. Or flip to MSNBC and be told by an absolutely panicked woman that this is exactly what fascism looked like, and the death camps were about to be rolled out. Were any of these things true? No. But there were motivations for the panic. On the one hand, there was the simple business motive. This made a whole lot more money than having a panel sit around and discuss the intricacies of agricultural subsidies. Yet it was clear that there was a real threat to the liberal project. What the media presented was that there was a growing army of radicalized far-right young men who were ready to start pulling out weaponry and become an unstoppable violent force, unless they were destroyed now. They spoke of secret radicalized groups hiding all around just out of view, groups who wanted to create a fascist state, and all of whom loved Donald Trump. Now, why would they tell this story? Well, it was true that this populist wave, though not a radical fascist army, was a danger to the establishment's liberal system and to the liberal project in general. It was entirely dependent on the globalized economic structure, on the influence of the media, on the liberal right-to-rule story, on the financial system, on immigration, and on the notion that more and more government could solve more problems, eventually leading to the end goal of an uplifted liberal state where all humanity were prosperous. This movement was saying that that was untrue. It wanted to end many of the economic structures. It wanted to end much of how the finances were done. It was opposed to much of the military policy. And while that was a major threat to the ruling institutions and the ruling class, particularly those who took their wealth and influence from international structures, it was also an attack on the liberal vision. Not because it was the opposite of the liberal vision, but because if that momentum ever stopped, and people stopped believing in it, then that would be it. The state could no longer justify intervening to build this uplifted liberal end state, because people wouldn't believe in it anymore. And while some believed the hysterical stories and wild claims about fascists hiding in the bushes, the more astute realized that there was a real attack on their vision. Take, for example, immigration policy. To be so aggressively opposed to illegal immigration struck directly at the heart of the internationalist tabula rasa message. It was saying that borders were necessary, and that not all people are the same, that different places are different, and that matters. People are not interchangeable. If that were true, it would mean the end of liberal internationalism. And for the right's part, because now the liberal establishment and the left had come to realize that they posed a genuine threat. They knew that if either the ruling neoliberal faction ever regained enough control, or if the more ideological left were ever to gain power, then it would be in their best interests to try to destroy the right. Both visions could not exist at once, so while the story spiraled off into hysteria, there was a reason for concern. The old system was ending, but only one vision could guide the future. Every ideological group had a problem. The new social justice left was only able to exert social influence so long as it had the support of the political apparatus and corporations. Yet this had a major flaw, as those interests would always come second to the greater financial goals. So if they were ever to make significant progress, then they would by necessity just be thrown aside. Similarly to how when a revolution happens, the revolutionaries are usually the first sent off to the prison camps. Various left-wing dissident groups, including the dissident progressivists and the communists, feared the rise of this populist force. Some believed that they could achieve their goals by working with the system, a sort of Fabian project, that they could achieve their desired end state by working with the ruling liberal institutions, and now that the system was under attack, that would mean that they would not be able to implement their goals. The problem they had is that they were never going to be allowed to implement their goals. They would always be placated by the liberal establishment, but they would never be allowed to get what they wanted. And this is something they started to realize. More and more began to join the ranks opposed to the neoliberal institutions, becoming more radical and revolutionary. Much of the more classical communists had realized this for a longer time, with some starting to view liberals as their primary enemy. The liberals were facing destruction. Many wished, couldn't we just go back to the 1990s? But the answer is no. That will never happen. Some started to look toward more classical notions of liberalism, believing that going back to earlier forms of liberal belief might be a starting place. The problem with this is that you can never work back in a philosophy. You can take notions that existed in the earlier state of a philosophical system and apply them to new systems, but it can never be reversed. So they were in a predicament. Many became upset, blaming the populists. If only they hadn't pointed out these problems, everything would still be fine. A lot of their anger was a blame the messenger problem. If everyone had just pretended not to notice the problems, then there wouldn't be problems. It was a desperate wish for things to go back as they were decades ago. Yet the problem is, the financial reality of what had been built up over the prior centuries meant that this system had to end one way or another. It was going to become something new, and no matter what society wanted to do, there was no way around it. Become communists, become fascists, throw out your smartphones and pretend you're in the 90s, it wouldn't matter. A process had been started in 2008, a process that could not be arrested. Things were going to change, and it just depended on whose terms. Many conservatives were facing similar dilemmas. In order to conserve and create a more conservative society, they would have to let go of many of their notions, many of their narratives and stories. They couldn't look to the founding fathers and to the period surrounding World War II as they had in the past. In a quite ironic way, if they wanted a more conservative society, they would have to look to the future and not the past. This created an opportunity for the further right. They had relatively small numbers, but were able to do quite well on the internet. Noticing that everyone was facing problems that they couldn't look in the eye, they spotted an opening and started to pitch their perspectives. Some were more Christian traditionalists, some of them more fascistic and statist, while others entirely new ideas. And as this began to happen, some of the more traditional communists spotted what was happening and noticed the opportunity. They attempted to spread their beliefs as well. The only problem is that they would have to displace the new left that had emerged. All sorts of new and radical ideas were emerging and proliferating at a rapid pace. All the while, the equity value of America's stock market was exploding upward. The values of the large tech firms of the United States were growing very quickly. Particularly driven by passive investing, they came to encompass more and more of the American economy. Yet smaller companies were still struggling. Young people were experiencing a great degree of struggle as well. Things hadn't gotten much better for them since 2008, particularly exacerbated by the extremely high and onerous levels of student debt, as well as home ownership becoming more and more out of reach. With so much of American capital being passively invested into a handful of the largest companies, and young people facing such an enormous debt burden, young people increasingly became radicalized and more opposed to the system, all while media on all angles fanned the flames. Tension was getting extreme. Despite Britain's vote to leave the European Union, the actual implementation of Brexit still hadn't been done. By 2019, Prime Minister Theresa May's withdrawal agreements are repeatedly rejected by Parliament. It seemed that despite the vote, opposition to Brexit was unwilling to back down, and frustrated by this continuing impasse, on June 19, 2019, Theresa May would resign, with Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister. He would publicly take the position that he and the Conservative Party were going to, quote, get Brexit done. Boris Johnson is another one of these interesting figures. In many regards, he's almost the perfect British politician, yet in others, he's highly unusual. He was born in 1964 Manhattan, not the United Kingdom, the son of Stanley Johnson, who would become an author, a member of the European Parliament. He would work at the World Bank, and as part of a panel on population control. His mother was Charlotte Johnson, a painter, and whose father, Sir James Fawcett, was head of the European Commission on Human Rights. Young Boris was highly studious and showed a particular aptitude for language and literature, yet he would also be remarked upon as showing great instances of laziness. He grew up in the United Kingdom and Belgium. He would end up studying at Eton and later Oxford, attending both with close friends Darius Guppy, a South African businessman who would spend time in prison after being convicted of insurance fraud, and Charles Spencer, who is the Earl Spencer. He would spend his time at Oxford, particularly involved in literature, becoming the editor of the satirical publication Tributary. He would also be invited into the Bullingdon Club, a small exclusive dinner club at Oxford, whose membership has consisted of many students who would go on to be prominent political and business figures. It's also quite known for drunken rowdiness. After Oxford, he would go to work for The Times and The Telegraph, being one of the few authors expressing Eurosceptic positions. He would later become a columnist for The Spectator and GQ, before becoming MP for Henley in 2001, and later the London Mayor in 2008. He would be the subject of many scandals while as mayor, including affairs, accusations of cronyism, excessive expensing, promising to donate 20% of his pay as an author to charity, only to not do that, and to later refer to his pay of £250,000 as chicken feed. He would also be accused of lying and exaggerating in media, which, yeah, okay. Despite all this, he was quite popular, and in 2015 he would return to Parliament, becoming MP for Uxbridge. During this time, he would support the Leave campaign. It's curious that he would be opposed to being part of the European Union, when his own past is so tightly intertwined with it, his relatives being closely involved. Also, on paper, he's almost the perfect British politician, yet he showed opposition. He supported the Leave campaign. This is quite curious, and its curious nature is something that will show up again further into his prime ministership. In 2019, the Conservatives would win a sizable majority on this promise to get Brexit done. Tensions were getting even higher in Britain. The issues associated with immigration at the time of the Brexit vote had come to look small compared to what they were now. People were extremely dissatisfied, and the economy was not doing much better. There was a sense of hopelessness, and seeing the government so resistant to implementing Brexit, seemingly refusing to accept the will of the people, including multiple attempts at having a revote, with the argument, oh, people were just frustrated. People would have voted differently if they had known that they would actually get the leave vote. Let's do it again. This created some strong resentment. People just wanted their vote enacted. And with that sentiment, the Conservatives had a strong grip on Parliament, and Boris Johnson on Downing Street.